Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final episode of 2021 of the OWASP DevSlop show. What a year it has been. Today's episode is going to talk about current threats against application identities in the Microsoft cloud. It is entitled, Do You See What I See? And our presenters are Shinesa Cambric, who you all know because she's been a co-host on this show many, many times, and Etan Basseri. Welcome, everyone. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I've been a co-host on the show previously, and I'm super excited to be a co-presenter today with one of my colleagues from Microsoft. So I am a principal program manager with our Intelligent Protections Group at Microsoft. I've had a career that's been focused on GRC, identity, security architecture, the range, run the gamut. On the personal side, I'm a huge Marvel fan. I feel like there's a lot of parallels between Avengers movies and cybersecurity, and I'm also passionate about diversity within cyber. So, Etan?
Thanks, Shinesa. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Etan Basseri. I'm on Shinesa's team. I'm a senior PM at Microsoft as well. My career is primarily focused on risk management, identity and access, and machine learning. And personally, we're a Lego family at home. We love to build stuff. I love to build stuff at home. I love to build stuff with Microsoft. So, and I'm also really passionate about helping veterans join the tech industry when they're exiting out of their active duty. So let's get into it. So today we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about a concept called workload identity. Workload identity is a term that encompasses application identities. It's slightly broader than that. We're going to talk about some of the attack trends and the threats that we've been seeing from our side, some of the ways that you can be addressing those attacks and some of the proactive defenses you can be thinking about, and as well as some practical takeaways for you as well. So before we can talk about all the threats and such, we need to get into what is a workload identity. What do we mean by that? So I'm actually going to share some of our documentation that we have about this, because this actually is one of the key things to understand about the Microsoft cloud and how we define applications. We have two concepts of objects when it comes to applications in the Microsoft cloud: the application object and the service principal object. This becomes important because some applications are what we call single tenant or line of business apps. This would be an application that's built for your organization, only for your organization. Also have a concept of a multi-tenant app. This would be like a SaaS app that you or another organization has created, but that you've instantiated in your tenant and other organizations have used in their tenant. These have a very interconnected and inseparable relationship between them. We're not going to go through all of those details, and we'll share the links out to this. But what's important to understand is that it all starts with registering an app in Azure AD. That's how you create the identity. And then the service principal is actually the security principal that can acquire a token from Azure AD, the identity provider. So again, you need both of those things to be able to run an app, have it authenticate to Azure AD. I'll show you right now how we're gonna create an application in Azure AD. So we'll do it in Graph. And for those who aren't aware, Microsoft Graph is basically a programmatic way to call all of Microsoft's public APIs in a very, smooth and elegant way. The tool I'm using is Graph Explorer, but there are any number of tools you can use, Postman, whatever, to call Graph. And we're going to be doing single calls in this type of demonstration. If you wanted to do multiple things, you can use PowerShell to do that. And so here I've done a get call against the application collection. This get call is going to return all the applications in my organization. That's not something that we need for the demo, but I just want you to understand the schema a little bit, because every application has an object ID assigned to it. It's going to have it's going to have a specific app ID, which is a different GUID, different identifier. It's going to tell you some things about hey, has Microsoft disabled this application for some reason? It's going to have information about what roles it's been assigned. Any sort of, we use the term key credential to refer to a certificate. So whether that's a self-signed certificate or an X509 cert, that'll be listed here. Additionally, whether there's been a password added. So one thing that's important to understand in the Microsoft Cloud is that there's different credential types. You have secrets, which is basically a password string, and you have certificates. And there are different ways you can have certificates work. You could have an X509 cert, you can have a self-signed cert. We also have something called managed identity, which is where Azure actually manages the credential on your behalf and rotates it automatically. So if I wanted to create an identity, an application identity, I'd go to Graph Explorer, I'd go to post against our V1 endpoint for applications, and I would pick the name of an app. So here I have one called V1. I'm going to make one called V2. I put that in the request body, and I run the query. And it returns it back. I got a 201, and I have a new ID, which is right here. I'm going to copy this because I'm going to need it in a minute. And you see, I've got my display name, Amazing OWASP App V2. This application object by itself has no permissions to do anything. It can't even get a token because it doesn't have a service principal yet. As an aside, if you do this sort of thing in our portal, and we'll share the portal in a minute, it's a little bit more automated and orchestrated. So when you register an app in the portal, it automatically creates a service principal. Here, you need to do it yourself. But registering the app, as I've just done, does nothing except just create an object against which you can configure. You can configure the redirect URI, we can configure the permissions, etc. Okay, so we have that. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to add a secret to this. So I go to post and I specify the object ID in the actual query URL. And it returns back a 200, and I have it here. So I should have also noted that you can specify the name of the key ID here. I didn't do that here. I didn't put a display name, so it's just null. Null just means unspecified. But you could say like, okay, this is my let's say December 2021 secret that I'm defining, right? All that kind of stuff. And then it actually gives you. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to level set here, we created an object with our first endpoint, right? That first post request. And now we're adding a password to that object. We haven't added any security principles yet. We haven't done anything else, but now we have an object that now has a password that controls access to.
Hold on. Still can't get a token, right?
Yep.
Still can't get a token, but I've defined it. Now this is what the actual value is. This is the only time in the workflow that you're going to get this value, this GUID, right? This is the secret. And that's important because hopefully you'll be using some sort of key management to keep this secure. There are ways to specify what your secret is using commandlet. I think PowerShell CLI does it, but it's not recommended that we recommend that you just have an automatic. If you're going to use a secret, first of all, we recommend that you use managed identity. But if you're not going to do that, we recommend that you use a certificate. If you're not going to do a certificate, please use a complex secret. Please do not specify admin or password for your secret. Okay,
Please.
You'll see why in a few minutes why you should not do that. All right, so we have the object, we have the secret. Now we need a way for this app to acquire a token from Azure AD. So we're going to go to we're going to post against the V1 endpoint for what's something called service principal. When we talk about service principals before, service principal is the object that can acquire a token. It is the representation of the app in the tenant. It's the security principal for that app. So I was doing something earlier. I'm just going to substitute in the app ID that I had before and copy paste. It's a little funky sometimes in Graph Explorer. Let's just do it this way. Come on. Doesn't want to cooperate today. Come on.
And while you're pasting that in, what does Azure AD have that we want?
But yeah, I should mention Azure AD is one of the biggest identity providers in the world, right? As such, it's used by millions of organizations as the way to do single sign-on, as the way to create a security boundary around the data of an organization, right? And so the reason, first of all, we could back up and we could start talking about the ideas of zero trust and having a single point. But when we talk about identity, we talk about identity being the control plane. That is the way that all resources can get access to data in the organization. If you have multiple ways, if you have multiple identity providers, if you have multiple ways for applications to authenticate to each other, some applications have their own, authenticate directly to SQL, right? If you don't have it going through an identity provider, then your security team doesn't have visibility. You don't have visibility into what's happening in the organization. So by having a single identity provider, you get way more control over what's happening and what you want to happen. We're going to get into access control in just a few minutes here, but does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool. So, so we talked about creating a way for this application to acquire a token from manager AD. I've specified the object ID here, and I'm going to run the query. Oop, looks like it didn't like it. Okay, let me pull it again. Might actually want my app ID. Let's try that. You can see I don't do this one very often in Graph. I often do this in Portal line anyway. Okay. So now I've got a service principal called Amazing OWASP App V2, right? It is the local representation of that application in my organization. So that's basically how we how we begin to create an identity. If you wanted to test signing in with the app, blocking access for the app, and doing all those types of things, this would be enough to do that. Let's go back to our presentation. We can continue the discussion here. So I want to talk to you a bit about the Streetlight Effect. I don't know who's familiar with this. This is actually like a cognitive bias, I believe. So the Streetlight Effect, if you're not familiar with it, is there's a cop who sees a drunk man searching for something under a streetlight. He asks him, "Hey, what are you doing?" The drunk man says, "Well, I'm searching for my keys." So he gets down on all fours and he starts searching for his keys. After a few minutes, the cop goes, "Are you sure you dropped them here?" And he says, "No, I dropped them in the park." And he says, "Well, why are we looking here?" He goes, "Well, this is where the light is." Right? And the Streetlight Effect is this aspect of like, we in security have been focused on the most salient, visible threats in the environment. Most of those have been phishing attacks, ransomware, people being able to compromise through single-factor authentication, password spray. All those sorts of attacks have been so visible, so well known, and that's where people are putting their energies in. But the reality is that the same attacks, the same attempts to steal data, to compromise organizations, to disrupt organizations, those the same types of threats, they're just being now waged increasingly against application identities. So we're still seeing phishing attacks, we're still seeing password spray, but now we're seeing attackers expand their use of abuse, their attempts to attack application identities, and that's what's really, like, to me, outside of the streetlight. Like if you think of a circle, right, on the pavement, right outside that circle are all these threats against application identities. And I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about. And the reason why that's happening really is this lack of monitoring, not a lot of focus on it. I think there has been a lot of focus on other aspects of application identity. We think about, like, how do we prevent SQL code injection? Lots of people think about that. We talk about it in ISC squared, like it's obviously something that people are aware of. But when we think about them in, like, monitoring the sign of applications, right, that's a relatively new concept. Shinesa, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that this is really pervasive. So if you think about the interconnectedness within your company, and even outside of your company with other companies, as Etan mentioned, this is like the way attackers can kind of sneak in undetected, if you will, because nobody's looking for service accounts or service principals. They're always looking at what is a user itself actually doing. So this is kind of like a back door, and we're seeing these attacks start to increase. And so I think our next couple of slides speak to that a bit.
Yeah, let me go forward a little bit. Shinesa, you want to take this one?
Yeah. So a couple of data points here, again, that we're seeing application threats start to increase. One of the interesting statistics here is that 34% of organizations suffered from security incidents by malicious applications. So as of our weekend activities, I expect this to go up, and hopefully everybody knows what I'm referring to there. And then another interesting statistic is that 26 million user login credentials have been stolen through malicious apps. So I think it's really important that we not only look at the privileges that we're assigning individual users, but also the privileges that we assign to applications. And how do we monitor and detect anomalous behavior for those apps?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the interesting things you point out here, Shinesa, is like this is not a silo of threats. Like, the application identity thing is not like it's some separate thing, unconnected from user credentials and unconnected from other aspects of the environment. it's all connected, right? Users, the reason that human beings authenticate into their organizations to get to apps, to get to data, right? It's all connected. So I think what we're trying to share here is that these threats against application identities are threats against users. These threats against application identities are threats against your protected data. It's not really about the app. It's just sort of the vector.
Yeah, the entry point.
Yeah.
Kind of hidden door.
Yeah. So just underscoring what we've said before, these are not all new problems. The aspect of credentials in code, for example, is probably something, Nikki, I imagine this is something that you've covered maybe even in the past, of people having this bad habit of putting credentials in code. So we said we had an app secret. We find this stuff all the time, where could be the production, it could be the application that's running in production, it could be an app that's running in a test environment or in a different region. No matter what it is, we see it over and over again, developers checking in their code, their creds into code.
Yeah. And
that just, I mean, this actually came up in the SolarGate event, where it was all over Twitter. A security researcher pointed out to SolarWinds that one of the credentials for their update server was in a public repo, right? Now, I'm not saying I'm not trying to say that's like the reason why that happened, okay? But that just shows you how prevalent this problem is. And of course, the aspect of consent phishing. So for those who aren't aware, consent phishing is a type of attack where one user will get phished usually through email, and then the malicious app will take the consent from that initial user and then often try to phish other users in the organization by leveraging the initial compromised user's email account. So it looked like so if I get phished, and then it looks like I send an email to Shinesa and Nikki saying, hey, I found out this really cool OWASP video. Can you go click this link and check it out? And they click it, and now they're phished, right? And that's how the attacker spreads through the organization. So we're seeing that quite a bit more prevalently as well. But yeah, across the board, definitely more concerns around that. Shinesa?
Nikki, sounded like you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, but I didn't want to cut you off, so I didn't.
No, please go ahead.
So just a question on how you escalate privileges here. This is always about phishing. Like if you have one identity and you need to escalate privileges, you need the literal credentials of another identity. Are there techniques? I guess I'm thinking from the old school on-prem Active Directory world where there's privilege escalation pathways based on a lower privileged identity. Does that same model hold up in Azure AD world?
Yeah, I think, Shinesa, I'd be interested if you want to speak to this as well. I think it really depends. So many applications at the outset are given a very high level of standing permissions.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's just overprivileged by default, and you don't realize that. You lose a credential, and then boom, you suddenly find yourself in a bad situation.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's one scenario. Another scenario is maybe you take a service principal and you use that to add additional privileges to some other account or to some other user, or run a script that does that same behavior. So it is an entryway, to consider. And again, back to Etan's point, is that a lot of times when we set up, or not we, but when these service accounts are set up, people don't give a lot of thought to these could be an entry point for an attack.
Right.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that we're going to get to this in just a second. The interesting thing that we've noticed is it's the most basic attacks that have succeeded. Like, it doesn't take a lot of sophistication, unfortunately, to wage an attack against an overprivileged app in Azure AD. If the application has any admin privilege, it's going to be able to do some damage, right? So you have to be really careful about how those accounts are governed and provisioned. Yeah.
And I think the same concept applies, across different clouds. So I know our focus today is on Azure, but the same thing applies if you have an overprivileged service identity. That really needs to be looked at and assessed. So.
Yeah, so there's this question about assigning workload identity to workloads not hosted in Azure. So I think if you have we should probably need to double click on that. If you have an application, like we mentioned SaaS apps are absolutely supported in Azure AD today. So by registering that app, so we went through that demo and I showed you how you create an application. That is very much controlled in Azure AD, even though the code is hosted somewhere else. So now it gets a little more complicated if you are trying to have the identity outside of Azure AD. That's where we have some work that we recently announced around what we call federated identity for workloads. We won't have time to get into that today, but we can certainly share the documentation on what's happening with that. So there is some work happening there with basically the same way we do B2B identity federation for users, for guest accounts and all that kind of stuff. There is a capability to do federated identity for non-human accounts as well. Anyway, Shinesa, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so I'll just go over this really quick. Again, I think this is something that we're all pretty much aware of at this point. Hot news as of this weekend with the Log4j vulnerability. And things to consider here are, not just protecting your own environment, but who else that you're connected to that may be vulnerable to this. And is this being used as a gateway into your environment? We're seeing attacks increase across SMBs, across governments, across education sector. And your company may not be one of those, but you may be connected to one of those. So vice versa. So don't allow this to be an entry point, a vector into your environment. I think one of the important things here is to look at least privilege and making sure that any service accounts or application identities have that least privilege. And you're looking at defense in depth so that when things like this take place, you know there's other guardrails that are in place. So.
And that's actually a great transition into sort of the framework that we think about these identity threats. There's really, if I had to oversimplify it, and I like to oversimplify things, it's really comes down to three things. Compromised application is a legitimate app that's been hijacked. So this is like a payroll application. So our team lead, Alex Weiner, was just tweeting about this yesterday. He was saying, imagine a payroll app. The payroll app has now been completely compromised. That payroll app needs to come back online, needs to be secured, remediated, and back online really as soon as possible, right? Especially payroll, we all want our paycheck, right? But that I contrast that with a malicious application. Malicious application has been created by an attacker for bad purposes. That application is never going to be legitimate, right? Its only purpose was to infiltrate organizations and steal their data. And in that situation, Microsoft has an entire team dedicated to detecting, shutting down, and notifying customers about these sorts of threats, right? And the final category is the aspect of a misconfigured application, an application that is so badly misconfigured either within Azure AD because it's over-permissioned or has some very long-lived credential, or outside of Azure AD, like a leaked credential in a public GitHub repo, that makes it susceptible to compromise. It's like basically, in Zero Trust, we say assume breach, right? That's one of the pillars of Zero Trust. So we find a leaked credential in a public repo. We might not have evidence that it's been exploited, but because it's so bad, because it's such a acute violation of our security policies, we treat it as breached, right? And we immediately want to roll that credential and notify the right people about it. And as Shinesa was mentioning about the Log4j 0 day, that kind of actually cuts across a few of these things. Because it's definitely misconfigured, right? If you're unpatched, like there's a patch now for it, right? So if you're unpatched, you've got a misconfigured application. Once that gets exploited and you start to see some sign-ins in your organization that don't belong, we're going to treat your application as compromised, right? But it's important to distinguish from malicious because if you do have that payroll app that's been compromised, it does need to get back to a healthy state, right? It's not malicious in the sense that we don't want to shut it down. We want to get it back to a healthy point. We're going to share a couple of very high-level attack graphs just to illustrate this, and this is all based off of real attacks that we've seen happen in the wild. We've also included the MITRE attack framework code, so if you want to deep dive and double-click on any of these things, you'll notice actually there's some patterns across them. So with the first example I gave around a compromised application, usually what we see is a cloud administrator gets compromised. They might get phished. They might have left their password sitting around on a Post-it note, whatever it is, but that cloud admin has gotten compromised. And then we'll see the attacker impersonate that cloud admin, and what they'll do is they'll actually add credentials to an existing application. Remember, we saw in the demo, you can add creds to the app object. Well, what they'll do is they'll take their administrative privilege, they'll add a credential, because you can have multiple credentials on a single object. And the effect of doing that is, like Shinesa was saying earlier, fly under the radar a bit, because it's not going to disrupt the application from running because you haven't touched the existing credential. And most organizations aren't looking at the sign-ins for applications. So, you're able to go undetected for a while. This is why it's so important to be looking at the sign-in logs for both users and applications in your environment. And then finally, they're going to impersonate that application. And what attackers will usually do is they'll pick an application that has, like mail read or some other access to a important resource like email or SharePoint or some other thing. And they'll call the APIs to do that undetected. Shinesa, anything you want to add to this?
Nope. Keep going.
Okay. Now for the malicious application, a little bit different. We talked about it just now. There's a phishing email. Usually that'll start the whole process. A user consents to that application. So consent is a really important topic. We're not going to get super deep into what consent is in Azure AD, but basically what it is it's giving permission to an application to do something. And in this particular example, often what it asks the user to do is the permission to send mail on behalf of the user, right? And so this application will send user as Etan off to Shinesa and say who knows what, trying to get her to click something. So it'll impersonate the user. It might be used to phish others, or if I'm let's say it's a spear phishing attack and I'm an admin or the for the organization. Now it's just going to say, okay, well, I'm going to exploit Etan's high level global admin role, and I'm just going to call the APIs myself and steal everything as Etan, right? So that can vary a little bit. And then finally, with the misconfigured.
I'm sorry, Etan, if you want to go back one slide. So I think something that's really important to call out here is with the user impersonation is understanding what's a baseline behavior for that user. Is something out of the ordinary? Is this an anomaly, either for the application or for the end user themselves? And this can lead you to the fact that there's a malicious app that's operating in your environment.
Yeah, it's a great call out. And the final example of the misconfigured application, we talked about leaked credentials in a code repo. So not hard, really, to find these. Once the attacker finds the credential, they'll impersonate the application. They might enumerate the directory. So they might call Graph to find out who all is in the Azure AD directory and what kind of roles do they have. And then they'll try to elevate their privilege by taking over potentially taking over one of those roles, or by finding out what other resources can be exploited, and then call the APIs to steal data. So those are some of the sort of most common, at a high level, most common kinds of attacks that we've seen. Shinesa, can I hand off to you?
Yeah. So with that information in mind, understanding how do you need to address these attacks? I think the first thing is knowing your environment and making sure that you have some controls that are set there. So do you know which apps are running in your environment? Do you know where the creds are, where they're stored, how they're integrated? And then how do you assess the security health of those individual apps and identities? And Etan, if you want to talk about zero trust.
Yeah, so for those who aren't aware, zero trust is an industry concept that's really about checking and rechecking and revalidating access throughout the day, if I just oversimplify it. So just by virtue of being in the network does not mean that you belong in the network, right? And when we think about zero trust access, we're thinking about a few really key concepts here. We're thinking about, we mentioned assume breach, right? That's a concept that basically means assume that someone has penetrated your environment who doesn't belong. It's not to make you paranoid, but it's to make you vigilant and to really pay attention to what types of things are happening. Least privilege is another one. That's this is a concept that's been around for a very, very long time. So absolutely a part of zero trust, and we'll talk a little bit about some practical aspects of that as well. So I think one of the other things that we need to think about when we assume breach is, and Shinesa mentioned checking logs, is there's just too much data for humans to do all of this work. Shinesa mentioned anomalies. There's too many sign-ins, right? there's just the amount of data today has surpassed what is a human problem and is now like a math problem, basically, right? It's a problem that must be addressed through automation. And so we're going to show you today a couple of things about what our team is doing around automation to try and make that job for our colleagues in the industry a little bit easier. Shinesa, did you want me to go to the next slide, or did you want to speak to this a little bit more?
Yeah, I think we can move on to the next slide. Yeah. All right, so a couple of key tenets when it comes to addressing attacks. We alluded to this on the previous slide, but you want to make sure that you assess your environment. Do you know the risk posture that you're in? Do you know where your activity logs are and what's actually being logged? And do you know what privileges are being assigned and actually being used? The next thing you want to do is make sure that you have good prevention in place. So.
A quick question on the first one. If you're an Azure user, is it just looking at role assignments? Like, how do you actually know like the universe of privileges that exist per identity and whether that's good or bad? Is there any tooling around there that can help you kind of, hey, this looks like a pretty poor practice? What do you do there?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of tooling, and I have a separate slide that speaks about different people within the industry who have pulled things together. And then, of course, we have some reporting within Microsoft, but I do want to give people the option to, look at other vendors and how they've, come up with what permissions exist out there and what's high privilege when it comes to permissions.
Okay, cool.
All right. So under prevention here, Etan mentioned about detecting anomalies, and he's a great point that this is really a math problem. There's no way with the scope and the scale of APIs and apps and users that you're going to be able to look at this data manually and make sure those preventions are in place. So that leads us into the next point of automation. And making sure that any security policies that are defined for your company, that those are automated and running on a regular basis to assess that security posture. And then you also want to enforce the remediation of different things. So going back to least privilege for your service principals in your apps, making sure that they stay at a least privilege state. And then finally, your governance. So sorry, go ahead.
One point just to underscore your point about remediation. Folks, please make sure you have owners assigned to your applications.
Yes.
We have seen it time and time again. It's really easy when it's a user who gets compromised because you just call up the user, right? It's like that. You know how to get in touch with them. But when you have an application that has been compromised, and just particularly when it's a line of business application, you've got to have, as your incident response process, you've got to have on file the right contacts to know who owns this app, who can make a call, like whether or not this app can be temporarily shut down, right? Contained if there's an active threat. And who can be in charge of the remediation, getting this app back to a healthy state. I cannot tell you how important this is. I really recommend that you take the time when you have an IR process to work in a section, ensure you have a section worked in that says, we have identified every app owner who can make these decisions and take the right technical actions to fix things.
Yeah. I think that's a really great call out. From my time at other companies, that was always a pain point of who can make the call to shut down this particular app. So,
yeah.
And then the last piece, and it kind of goes back to the app owner piece that Etan mentioned, is making sure you recertify these service accounts on some regular cadence. Are they still in use? What type of data is being transferred with these apps and with these service accounts? And is it going to the place that you think it's going to? So what's the endpoint? So.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is like the same thing as a user problem, which is like you've given somebody some admin role or some very long-lived permission that lasts for like forever, and then you forget about it, and people come and go in the organization as normal, right? And nobody thinks about it. There's no reattestation, no recertification to say why is this credential supposed to last 99 years? Why does this app that has been mostly retired still have an administrative role in our environment, right? Those are really important questions, and they kind of, to your point earlier, Shinesa, it's kind of the soft underbelly, unfortunately, of the identity plane. It's a potential real weak point. So.
Yeah. And that's what we know attackers go after, is those weak points. So
yeah. All right, should we do the demo, Shinesa?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we're going to share a couple of things in the portal now. We showed you Graph. This is the Azure portal, and this is specifically the Azure AD Blade. What we're looking at here is the sign-in report. The sign-in report actually has 4 tabs to it for convenience. You have your user sign-ins. Those are the interactive sign-ins when user actually actively signing in. You have the non-interactive sign-ins, which has to do with when there's a refresh token and Azure AD signs in on behalf of the user. Then you have service principal sign-ins. We're talking about service principals this whole session. But what's interesting is we talked about managed identity briefly. Managed identity actually uses service principal under the hood. And so we've broken those out separately just for convenience so that you can see those. But one of the things that you'll see in a given service principal sign-in, we actually aggregate them here because they can be quite voluminous. You'll see the same ideas, same things around like the app ID, the things you saw earlier in the session. You'll see what kind of resource the service principal is trying to reach. You'll see a request ID for the specific sign-in event. This is like the unique widget just for that sign-in. And you'll also be able to go through different details like, was there a conditional access policy evaluated when this sign-in took place? They're probably asking me like, well, what is conditional access? Let's talk about conditional access for a minute. Conditional access is a access control engine native to Azure AD that allows you to do granular security policies, granular security access control policies for accounts in the directory. We've just recently announced an expansion of this to not only include users and groups, but to include workload identities. So now you're able to basically have a very granular access control for a specific app. Now, in this particular example, I'm just going to take a random service principal. I'm going to be defining, I'm just going to say OWASP example. I'm going to be defining a specific access control policy for this specific app, okay? It's called part supply. I'm going to say that whenever part supply authenticates, trying to get to anything, which here is all cloud apps, any type of resource, I'm going to set a condition. And I'm going to set a location-based condition. This is the first click stop of what we're doing here. This location-based says I can get to any location. Excuse me, I'm going to define a policy that says I'm going to block access to every location except I'm going to exclude something. I'm going to select a specific location. And the reason I'm going to do this, I'm going to do East Data Center. Okay. This app, Part Supply, is hosted at the East Data Center. So I only want a sign-in to originate from that specific data center. So I've excluded that from the policy. And I'm going to show you why. When I go to the access control, I'm going to say, I want you to block access, okay? So what's going to happen is when this app tries to authenticate and acquire a token, it's going to run, the conditional access engine is going to run, and it's going to say, are there any policies that apply? Yes, there is one. It says I need to block access, but there is a exception. That exception is that it can come in, it can get a token if it's coming from the East Data Center, okay? So that's how you define a conditional access policy for your organization down to that granular level for this specific app. You can do this obviously for multiple apps. There's a lot more fancy bells and whistles on this that the team has done. You can use an attribute to instead of doing a specific account assigned, and we'll share the details on that. Another really important thing that we talked about earlier that I want to share is the aspect of anomaly detection. There's too much data. Right? There's too many things happening in your environment for a human being to be able to assess all of the sign-ins and then figure out if any of those sign-ins are anomalous. We've done some of that hard work for you. And in this view we're sharing, we're talking about risky sign-ins for users. This is Azure AD Identity Protection. And what it does is it looks for risk-based authentication, risk in the environment for a given account. In this risky sign-ins example, this is looking for real-time risk that is detected at the time of sign-in. And so if you go to the details here, you can see that there's all these aspects that you're able to gather. And it says here, interrupted. Interrupted means that the user was challenged with multi-factor authentication, right? And if I go to the user's risk report, it'll show you that they've actually compromised. And we'd be able to go to their detections and say, why were they marked as such? Here, we see that there's a detection for unfamiliar sign-in properties. So this user, Jana, normally signs in from somewhere outside of Phoenix, Arizona, and all of a sudden signed in from this new location our system does not recognize it. Therefore, it's an anomaly. So we have these detections, which are the events, and those events roll up into user risk, basically account risk. And so you could have multiple detections. Jana here could have like 3 unfamiliar sign-ins from all over the world and a leaked credential and token theft detection and somebody has stolen our token. They could it's a one-to-many relationship, right? Some of it could be offline with the leaked credential example. That's something that we detect offline, or it could be at real time during runtime, right? And those are the types of things that we're looking for. Shinesa, is there any color you want to add to what I've been sharing?
No. Well, the only thing I would say is, in the situation like the vulnerability that's been announced this weekend, things like this are really critical because then you can block, certain apps and users if you don't expect them to come in from a particular location. So it takes that manual behavior of assessing security posture and automates it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And does this, like all the data that flows in through 365, does that land in the same area here? Can you correlate that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The Azure AD is the identity provider for Microsoft 365 and Azure and Dynamics and now like many services, right? But it's not only that, right? So it's really important to understand that Azure AD is a identity provider for all users, all organizations, and all applications. But yes, all sign-ins, we talked about having identity as the control plane, right?
Yep.
And so if you have Microsoft 365, if you use Office, yes, all of your sign-ins show up here.
Got it. So you have a lot of data to model, sort of risky sign-ins on, is basically what that boils down to as well.
Yeah, we process billions of authentications per day in Azure AD, and we run all of those. And some other organizations, either for practical reasons or others, they don't run against a global data set. They'll run like a smaller data set and try to expand that to the larger sample size. So they'll say, oh, well, we're gonna take like 5% of our traffic and we'll look for anomalies. And if that stuff is anomalous, then we apply it to all. We don't do that. We take all of it. And we take signal not just from the identity and from the sign-ins. We take information from Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center, who is looking for, looking at like APTs and all those sorts of threats. We're looking at information from Defender and Microsoft Defender, and what are they seeing against devices and endpoints, right? So we're correlating a lot of data across the company. Now, there's
a question that's super related to that is, how does Sentinel fit in to the problem set you're describing there? Can Azure Sentinel help here? What would it do?
Yeah, so there's a native integration with Azure Sentinel. If you have Azure Sentinel, you can add in identity protection data. So for those who aren't aware, Azure Sentinel is a cloud-based SIEM tool that Microsoft created. And it has a lot of bells and whistles that you can do with it. But one of the things you can do is you can stream in the risk information from identity protection. Microsoft 365 Defender is another important tool. And I think there was a question around that just made me think of it. It went and then it popped up. But it popped up and then went away. But similarly, you can do correlation. So what's cool about Defender is you can correlate the identity protection data with the device information, with the app information, and that maybe information protection data labeling information, and it creates this sort of visual graph, if you will, of the different relationships between these things. Right? So lots of good investigative tools, and maybe that's a follow-up session we'll do another time. But so in this particular screen, we showed you how you get down to like the individual sign-in, right? Like super, super granular. But for a second, let's zoom out. Let's zoom out all the way to look at risk analysis for the entire organization. So here we are in what's called Workbooks. Workbooks is a way to visualize log data in Azure. It's really cool, actually. It uses Kusto query language. You basically take your logs, you send them to Azure Monitor, and then this tool lets you do like really fancy, like kind of Power BI, dashboard stuff with it. But it's like way bigger data sets than you can do with Power BI. So like, here's an example of like, where's all the risk distributed in my organization by user, by location, right? So where's most of the risk being generated in the world, right? What's the ratio of detections that are happening offline versus real time? So this is like your roll up, right? I showed you a dashboard where you can say, oh, well, here's all your risky users. that's all well and good. What if I'm running an organization of 200,000 people? I don't have time to go through every single account. And my CISO or my stakeholders have no way to get their head around, like, what does it mean to have 100 risky users? So here you have like a much more aggregated view that can be used to kind of manage risk at a more strategic level. Shinesa, do you want to add anything to that?
I think you covered it. From a CISO level, of course, they love their data, which this workbook gives. I do want to address one question that was in the chat from Not for Scott about risk. It would be good if risky users also checks devices. So one of the cool things that we have is with conditional access, you actually can check the posture of devices.
Yeah, absolutely. If I go back here and pick a user, we can actually say, require a compliant device, for example. So we could say, specific platforms that you want to have. You can say that the device, yes. You can say the device platform, device state needs to be compliant. So either have Azure AD joined or marked as compliant, right? So absolutely. I mean, this is actually one of the very first integrations that we had between conditional access and Microsoft Intune. This was like the hero scenario for years, was the ability to do device compliance enforcement at runtime for sign-in. So great point, and yes, very good to do that.
Yeah, very important from a zero trust standpoint.
Absolutely. Shinesa, do you want to speak through some of these?
Yeah, before I jump into this, so there should have been a link posted in the YouTube channel in regards to a survey. We would love to get your feedback on what you thought about the session, things that we can add or improve, or knowledge we can share. And also within that survey, there's a link in regards to a giveaway, and I believe that needs to be done by 3 p.m. today. And maybe Nikki can confirm that one.
Yeah, 3 p.m. Yeah, an hour after the show, which is 3 p.m. Eastern today.
Actually, let me just jump in. We'll announce the winner before the end of the session, and they just need to contact us before 3:30 p.m. today. So it's 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, just because registration closes soon, so we want to make sure that we have contact with you. Make sure that you're available between on December 15th and December 17th to participate to the training if you want to win.
Thank you, Nancy.
No worries.
Right. So we've talked a lot today about different attacks, about why we think it's important to assess the security posture of your service principals and application identities. So I'm giving a little bit of homework, and we'll make sure these links are shared out to everyone. But there's a lot of places where you can go, a lot of GitHub repos where you can pull in information to do simulation and threat hunting in your environment and understand what your existing security posture is. There's also a lot of resources in regards to auditing and applying security controls. We've actually had a few guests on the show here, such as Kennard McQuaid, that does cloud guardrails. And so using that information to assess what roles are assigned in your environment, what security policies are implemented in your environment, I think are really important. Another really good call out here is maybe the last link that I mentioned about permission references for Azure RBAC. That's been done by Ian McKay. And so he's been working on a project to pull in the different access between all of the cloud providers and do some comparisons there. And I think that's some really neat work. Okay. All right.
Let's check the chat.
Right. All right, so a couple of key takeaways. Number one, making sure you assess your environment and your environment footprint. Do you know what applications you have that are running and which IDs and what the access is that's assigned to it? Number two is making sure that you've set up protections for your environment. Within Azure ADs, Etan demonstrated that we have conditional access. We have risky user policies that can be put in place. And then that kind of leads into the third bullet of automate. There is so much data, there's so much scale here that there's no way a person can manually do all of this. So look into opportunities and solutions that allow for automation of that assessment and that protection. And Etan?
Yeah, you said it. Nothing to add there.
All right. And so, yeah, just ending with a few other resources. Again, I will make sure that this is available to the community. One thing that I want to point out that's really cool that I recently received is this penetration testing for ethical hackers for the Azure environment. Really, really good book. I recommend this if you are looking to learn more about penetration testing for Azure.
I will drop a link in the chat to that book.
And thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time and the attention today. Etan?
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here, and yeah, enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, I guess that is it from us, right, Nancy? Do we have anything else to say before the end of the year here?
No, we're taking a break until January, where I think the first show from the Australian team will be on January 4th or 8th. Anyways, we'll update you. So please follow us on social media. Before we leave, I'd like to announce the winner. I will be closing the form. If you're patient with me, I will do that right away.
And while she's running the winner, we'd just like to thank you all for tuning in week after week after week in 2021, as we worked really hard to get you guys, good content, on a variety of topics that we think is, very actionable to our audience and our community. So any feedback welcome. We're more than happy to entertain show ideas or host ideas. But we thank you so much for sticking with us every Sunday. So, yeah. We have a winner here, Nance?
Yes, our winner is Nelson Mendez. So here we go. Let me put that in.
All right, Nelson.
So, congratulations, Nelson. We will put the email where you can contact us and claim your prize. Make sure that you're available on December 15 again and December 17 for the training with Jim Manico. So thank you, everyone. And,
cool.
Is that it?
And I guess that's it. Happy holidays, everyone. Enjoy some time off. Hope everyone gets some relaxing winter times after Log4j. I don't know. Yeah.
We'll see.
We'll see. Cool. Thank you guys also. Thank you guys again for joining us, and thanks for talking about Azure, and we will see you all in 2021.
2022,
yes.
All right.